American-backed regime changes don't have a great record. The toppling of Saddam Hussein in Iraq was followed by state failure and sectarian conflict that left hundreds of thousands dead. Then taking out Gaddafi in Libya was followed by civil war, state collapse, and by many accounts, the return of slavery. So will a fate this grim await Venezuela after the kidnapping and deposing of Nicolas Maduro? Well, there is one key difference to the Iraq and Libya examples. Unlike in those cases, the toppling of Venezuela's leader has not in fact led to the liquidation of the regime, and Trump seems to want Maduro's deputy, Delcy Rodriguez, to remain in power indefinitely, it seems. According to Western media as well, she has already, or her administration, has already ramped up repression in the country. So this was from the New York Times on Tuesday. So they reported, Maduro is gone, but repression in Venezuela has intensified. They say security forces have boarded buses, searched phones, and interrogated people looking for evidence that they welcomed the capture of Nicolas Maduro. The Washington Post had a similar story. So they said, fear grips Caracas as a new wave of repression is unleashed in Venezuela. And they say Venezuela's government launched a far-reaching crackdown after Maduro's ouster, detaining journalists and civilians and sending armed gangs to the streets. So this is the Venezuelan government, according to these reports, cracking down on opponents of what's essentially still the Maduro regime, just without Maduro. So there were lots of the Venezuelan opposition who thought that, Trump would come to their rescue. Actually, Trump's got rid of Maduro, left the regime in place, and now, according to these reports, they're being more repressed than they were before Trump got involved. So can we know about the reality on the ground across Venezuela, and can we predict whether its Trump-backed, puppet government, I suppose, can survive? I spoke earlier to Gabriel Hetland. He's Associate Professor of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the University of Albany and author of Democracy on the Ground, Local Politics in Latin America's Left Turn. I began by asking what he makes of the reporting on an apparent wave of repression in Caracas and beyond.
I think it speaks to the fact that this has been a regime change without a change of regime. So, Trump got rid of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, but the Maduro regime has remained relatively intact in terms of its military, political, and security apparatus. And so all of the repressive aspects of that regime, which we've seen for a number of years, are still there and probably worsening, according to recent reports. That's not entirely surprising. This is a regime that feels, profoundly under the thumb of the Trump administration and really jumpy. There was reports a night or two ago of gunfire in Caracas around Miraflores Palace. And apparently it was a friendly fire incident between two different security forces, where there was one force putting a drone above the presidential palace and another opening with gunfire. And so things are on edge. And so it's not surprising that the government would react to any activity that seems to be threatening at the domestic level with extra repression right now. But this clearly indicates that there's no sort of political transition. The question of democracy, human rights, political rights is absolutely not on the agenda for the Trump administration, and not something that the government in Venezuela is interested in either.
The stories as they're written up in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and elsewhere, what they seem to be suggesting is that the government is repressing anyone who comes out to support what Donald Trump has done, because they would sort of, by definition, be anti-Maduro people. So you've got this strange situation where Donald Trump is supporting and propping up, I suppose, a government which is repressing anyone who sort of openly claims to support Donald Trump. It's a strange situation we find ourselves in.
It is really strange, and it speaks to the surrealness of this moment, just the bizarreness of it all. All the evidence suggests that Delcy Rodriguez, under tremendous pressure, we have to say, is basically going along with the Trump administration. She has a sort of metaphorical and literal gun to her head. And so she is, pretty much doing what the Trump administration says. But she also has a Chavista past. She has a sort of revolutionary credentials over many decades, and she needs to appease her base within Venezuela, which is still a Chavista base, a Madurista base. And so some of her statements have been pretty contradictory. I mean, right after the kidnapping, the invasion, the coup, whatever we want to call it, happened, Delcy Rodriguez made a very fiery statement, a denunciation of what was happening, demanding that Nicolas Maduro return. A day later, she issued a much more conciliatory statement, promising and inviting the U.S. to work with Venezuela and her government. Since then, she's tried to walk a fine line between sort of asserting some degree of national independence and autonomy, but also conciliating Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, the U.S. government. So I think she's playing to multiple audiences, and I believe that the repression that we're seeing of sort of Venezuelans in support of what Trump is doing is an expression of that. And again, it's really weird because Rodriguez is actually pretty much doing what Trump wants, but then also repressing Venezuelans who are supporting that. So it's just really strange.
And the Trump gamble seems to be what we can do. Well, I suppose you say gamble, but in a way it's conservative, isn't it? Because he wants everything to stay the same. He thinks what can happen is everything stays the same. So there's not really any reform in the Venezuelan governing apparatus, apart from the fact that Maduro has been removed. And the only thing that's really changed is that the United States now gets direct access to the oil and can completely control the oil industry and the export of oil. Is that a sustainable situation? Do you sort of see that as something which, it might be unjust, it might be unsavory, but is that sort of on the most basic level, is that something a situation which can sustain itself?
We'll have to see. I doubt it. I think that there was a New York Times headline that they changed right after they ran it, but the initial headline was really apt. It said, Marco Rubio stresses U.S. plan to coerce rather than govern Venezuela. And that's really what we're seeing, that the U.S. wants a sort of neo-colonial grab of resources. It wants to dominate Venezuela and force them to do whatever it wants, but it doesn't want to actually run things on the ground. So will that produce stability? That's a crucial question. I think in the short term, it's possible that we will see some degree of stability precisely because so many things have remained the same. You still have the same military structure intact. You have the same political apparatus more or less intact. You have, a lot of similarities. Even the economic situation in Venezuela, which is dire, has been dire for a number of years. And what's also strange is that many of the changes that are happening now, which are blatantly unjust, blatantly neo-colonial, we have to say that, in terms of the U.S. gaining access or demanding access to the Venezuelan oil industry, demanding that Venezuela sever relationships with Iran, China, Russia, Cuba. Those are changes that Maduro was pretty prepared to give, that he was talking about giving for a number of months. So the situation that seems to be unfolding is actually one that the Venezuelan government wanted to happen over the last number of months. Not entirely, of course, but in broad strokes, it's pretty similar to what Maduro himself and other Maduro officials were proposing to the U.S. for quite a long time.
Can you talk a bit about what keeps the governing system together in Venezuela at the moment? Because, so talking about drugs, as far as I understand, the whole premise that the U.S. sort of intervention in Venezuela was about drugs is clearly a sham. It's a lie. And Donald Trump is basically being honest about that to some extent. He's saying actually it's all about oil. The claim is that they're pumping fentanyl into the United States. They don't even produce fentanyl. They're pumping cocaine into the United States. It's a small proportion of cocaine in the United States that goes via Venezuela. From the reporting I'd read, though, there was a truth to the idea that the Venezuelan government was involved in drug trafficking and drug smuggling. And the way this was happening is that due to economic collapse, it was difficult to sort of give government officials or leaders in the army a significant enough legitimate income to keep them loyal. And so what Maduro had done is to sort of say, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, I will tolerate you getting involved in illicit trade, which you can take a cut of if you remain loyal to me. Is that your understanding of a key way that the Maduro system, Maduro regime, whatever we want to call it, had continued to function even throughout economic collapse? And if so, where does the Trump coup leave that sort of modus vivendi?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is my understanding. So I think that corruption has been a major sort of source of stability within Venezuela for a number of years. The Maduro administration has been willing to funnel many sources of illicit sort of resources to generals, to the military within Venezuela. This is not just drugs. I don't think drugs are particularly important. They're not totally insignificant, but there's all sorts of illegal gold mining. There's massive sort of fraud within the government-run economy overall. There's been, fraud in the currency situation for a number of years. That's changed somewhat in the last 5 or 6 years. But corruption within Venezuela is a longstanding problem, but it has really exploded under Maduro, and it is a major source of the stability. I think that, and some of that also relates to the oil industry, and so all the sort of every aspect of Venezuela's economy and politics are embedded in a sort of network that is somewhat licit and somewhat illicit. And drugs are part of that, but again, I don't think a particularly important issue. And then going back to your original question, it strikes me that there is one major source of likely instability, which is the US oil blockade. If the oil blockade actually continues, and that's a really unclear thing right now, but if that actually continues and they limit the resources coming into Venezuela, that will be even more devastating for the population, but also lead to strains within the governing coalition within Venezuela. And so I think that that's something the Trump administration will need to think about a little bit more, and maybe hasn't thought much about so far.
Just for clarity, in terms of the oil blockade, you said sort of that's stopping resources getting into Venezuela. I mean, it's also, is the blockade about exports or imports? Or I suppose they export oil to, do they export oil to Iran, who then process it and then send it back to Venezuela? Talk me through how the economic blockade works. Let's take a couple of steps back here.
The basics of it are that, the U.S. on December 16th, Donald Trump declared a complete, I can't remember the exact language he used, but basically a complete blockade. He said of sanctioned Venezuelan oil, but then it seemed like the U.S. was actually going to try to stop even non-sanctioned oil. And of course, we have to say the U.S. has no right to do that. The fact that the U.S. has declared something to be sanctioned doesn't actually mean that the rest of the world has any reason to go along with that and the country involved. So the reporting on this is just sort of surreal and ridiculous because people are saying, oh, they're invading the sanctions as though this is some actual law of international, trade, but it's not. But, leaving that aside, the oil blockade is really about Venezuela exporting its oil to countries like Iran, Russia, China, primarily, and, sometimes other places as well. They export some oil to Cuba, but that's not a major source of income for Venezuela. So the income that they get from exporting their oil elsewhere is profoundly important. And this has been true for many, many years, many decades, even within Venezuela, that they use that income to import all sorts of things, food, medicine, all sorts of resources that are useful for the population and provide income for the government as well. And so the major concern is that to the extent that the U.S. continues with a blockade of Venezuela's ability to sell its oil abroad and get income for the government, this could have profound implications. Scholars have talked about the possibility of the first major famine in the Western Hemisphere in anyone's memory, in addition to the profound sort of political and economic implications for the government itself. So it's hard to overstate how important oil is to Venezuela. And what we're talking about with the blockade, again, is really sort of exporting oil and then taking the income and using it for all sorts of purposes, including, we should mention, keeping generals and other sort of military officials relatively happy.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of why the oil is going to Iran, because people think, well, Iran, why are Iran and Russia importing oil? Because they produce loads of oil. It's because Venezuela produces this very thick crude oil, which they don't have the capacity to process. So it gets processed in Iran and Russia. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's part of it. And then the other really important factor is that the U.S. has stopped importing Venezuela oil with some exceptions. So Chevron has continued to produce and sort of send some oil to the U.S. for the last couple of years. But since 2019, there's been virtually a complete oil blockade within the U.S. This is under Trump 1. During the Juan Guaido self-declared presidency in Venezuela. And ever since then, even under Biden, this continued. There was, a little bit of carve-outs under Biden, mostly for Chevron, but then that's been tightened a little bit under Trump. And then really tightened, with this December 16th full blockade. So but the U.S. one goes back a number of years. And so that's the other reason that Venezuela is sending oil to Iran, Russia, and then China. They're not refining the oil, but they're just getting Venezuelan oil, which again is crucial for the Venezuelan economy.
And in terms of the oil, so Javier Blas, he's energy and commodities columnist at Bloomberg. He was tweeting earlier today about the U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright, who has said at the Goldman Sachs Energy Conference that the U.S. is going to completely control Venezuela's oil. And it will then export it and sell it and market it and process it, and then give some of the money back to the Venezuelan people, which I suppose would imply the end of the blockade. And if that were to happen, I suppose, is there an outcome where everything stays the same in Venezuela, except they have a slightly better source of income because the sanctions have in effect on their oil exports being lifted? Now, of course, a big cut of that is going to be going to American corporations, but a sort of degraded cut of a decent export income is potentially higher than a full cut of no export income. So is there a world in which the lives of Venezuelans improves over the next couple of years?
So I'll lay out the possibility of that, which I think, we could plausibly sketch that. I don't think it's going to happen, and I'll tell you why in a second. But the most optimistic scenario indeed would be that essentially the U.S. sanctions regime, including on oil, which is the most important part of it, ends. And Venezuela is able to export, massive amounts of oil to the United States. The Venezuelan state can have that income. That income can be used to provide for the needs of Venezuelans. Economic growth can resume even more. It had been resuming for a couple years in Venezuela until the last couple months of U.S. pressure. But that would be the most optimistic scenario. The reason that I'm doubtful about that happening is because Trump has explicitly said he will be the one to control the profits, and he will be the one to decide how much of those profits go to Venezuela. And it's not clear that he has any interest in the well-being of the Venezuelan people, to put it mildly. And, if Venezuela's economic situation got worse, there would be massive outmigration. That's obviously a problem for the U.S. It's a problem for Latin America. You could see, hundreds of thousands, even millions more Venezuelans leaving the country if there's an economically devastating situation. In the event that, this is a worst case scenario where the U.S. is sort of holding most of the resources from the oil that it's receiving from Venezuela and not sending those resources, not sending those profits back to the Venezuelan state. So if that happens, there'd be this migration crisis, but I think that Trump wouldn't be upset with that because it serves his domestic political agenda. And he can say, we got to stop the hordes of immigrants coming from Venezuela, and he can just sort of play it both ways. The consequences for ordinary Venezuelans, though, would be utterly horrifying. So, there may be something in between. I mean, I think there's going to be a give and take. The U.S. does not have unlimited control. As we've talked about, Delcy Rodriguez, the acting president, needs to provide a semblance of national sovereignty, although it's a thin one. She needs to provide some degree of continuity with the earlier project, including on the ideological level. And so it's a complicated situation with a lot of uncertainty.
I mean, you've mentioned a worst case scenario there. I suppose, to my mind, a worst case scenario is, state collapse, civil war. You see something like what happened post-regime change in Iraq or Libya. Is that possible in Venezuela? Or I suppose that, there aren't the same sectarian divides. Maybe a sort of civil war that violent isn't on the cards in Latin America in the 21st century. I don't know. What would be the worst case here?
Yeah, no, I think that exactly is right. There are a lot of armed groups within Venezuela. There is, massive illegal gold mining. There's other illegal sort of mining activity in parts of Venezuela, the so-called Arco Minero, which is in the sort of south central part of the country. And then there's a lot of armed groups elsewhere in the country as well. And so if there was a major loss of income for the government and for the country as a whole, I think that a lot of those armed groups would be unhappy, and you could, in fact, see major conflicts. We haven't seen that yet, and I think that that is good. It's nice that there hasn't been, an eruption of armed conflict, but that potential is absolutely there. And I think, something like Iraq is not unthinkable within Venezuela. And so this is another thing that I think, policymakers, including within the U.S. government, will have to consider. I think there are some who are considering that. And the reason I say that is because Trump didn't want to have Maria Corina Machado and the far right opposition come into power in Venezuela, not for particularly ideological reasons, but for pragmatic reasons. There's a lot of reporting now showing that, they didn't feel like Machado and the right could actually govern Venezuela, could actually provide stability. And so this question of stability is certainly one that they are thinking about, and it's an important factor in their sort of calculations. But again, there's just so much uncertainty that we'll have to see what happens.
And where does this all leave the opposition? Because, as far as I understand, in the 2024 elections, it was the candidate supported by Maria Corina Machado who got the most votes. And then the voting tallies were, Maduro refused to publish them. So there clearly is some level of support for Machado and her political faction within the public. And the assessment that I think Trump has made, correct me if I'm wrong, is that she didn't have the support among Venezuelan government elites. So sort of she couldn't garner the confidence of the army or business elites because they thought that she can't protect stability and relative security, as far as we can say, that exists in Venezuela. So where do the people who voted for Machado's candidate in 2024 come in here?
Yeah, so I think, two parts to your question. One, where does this leave the opposition? Out in the cold, essentially. I mean, you have seen Trump explicitly reject Machado. You've seen Machado become a little bit more critical of Trump. She's sort of taking multiple stances. She's being very supplicating in some interviews and then critiquing some of the things he's doing, including critiquing Delcy Rodriguez. And then a separate question is the Venezuelans who, provided support for Machado and extremely likely voted, a majority for Edmundo Gonzalez. We don't know for sure, what the vote was in 2024. But as you said, all the evidence suggests that he, in fact, won that. He was kind of a stand-in candidate for Machado. I think it's important to recognize that many Venezuelans provided support for Edmundo and for Machado, not so much because they supported their political position, which is a pretty hard right, far right position, but because they wanted to get rid of Maduro, because they were so frustrated with the economic mismanagement, the political repression, the lack of continuity with the Chavista project, which was vastly better despite its own contradictions. And so I think that opposition to Maduro is probably, translating into significant opposition to Rodriguez, although I don't know that it'll take particularly big expressions anytime soon, given the repressive capacity of the government. But I don't know that it necessarily translates into support for Machado. I think it's more of an anti-government position as opposed to a support for the far-right opposition.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's basically a case of there probably will still be opposition to Delcy Rodriguez as there was opposition to Maduro in 2024, and it was presumably a majority of the Venezuelan people. But now the wager by Trump and Rodriguez is that given that the repressive capacity of the state remains intact and potentially the end of the blockade on oil, that could potentially lead to some economic growth, then that would be how the system is maintained. So you've still got people who are relatively disgruntled, but don't have the capacity to organize to overthrow Delcy Rodriguez. And especially some of them might have less urgency to do so if their incomes increase slightly. You've said that's a unlikely outcome, but it's a possible one.
Yeah, it is certainly a possible outcome, and it would be a continuity with what we've seen over the last 8 or 9 quarters within Venezuela. I mean, there was a devastating economic crisis, which was caused by many factors, mismanagement, and U.S. sanctions is a very, very significant one. And that had lessened in the last 2 years, roughly. And so maybe we'll get back to that. I mean, I think that that is actually plausible to think, especially if there is a softening of the U.S. sanctions regime. If Venezuela could start pumping significantly more oil. I mean, last year they were pumping about 1.2 million barrels of oil. I think that's per day. And then, they could get to a higher level than that. But that is, there's possibilities that they will drastically go down, depending on how the oil blockade works out. But if they were able to increase their oil production, even if the U.S. is taking a cut, that could provide additional income and definitely lessen the disgruntlement of the Venezuelan population. I think that there's, two sources of that disgruntlement. There's an economic and there's a political source. But the economic one, I think, is the most pressing on a day-to-day basis. I mean, if Venezuelans can't eat, if they can't meet their basic necessities for themselves and their children, they're just going to have this level of desperation. So that will be the priority for people. And if the situation improves economically, you'll see some degree of support for Rodriguez. And if the situation doesn't improve economically, then I think the sort of political resistance could escalate a little bit.